This program is made possible in part by grants from public television stations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Exxon Corporation, and the Ford Foundation.
Good evening from Washington. Robert MacNeil is off tonight. The U.S. Senate is in the process of reforming the way it operates. Yesterday, the Senate Rules Committee okayed a compromised version of a reorganization plan that would cut down the number of Senate committees and subcommittees and make other streamlining changes. Its overall aim is to combat the overlap, inefficiency, and confusion that now exists over committee jurisdiction, cut down the conflicting committee demands on the individual senators, and generally retard the topsy-like growth of the committee system. But there are problems. Some senators are upset over the abolition of certain committees. They have promised to fight to the death of the entire plan if necessary. The Rules Committee compromise would cut the number of standing committees from 31 to 23, subcommittees from 174 to 125. It would also impose restrictions on the number of committee assignments and chairmanships each senator could hold. It would computerize committee scheduling and for the first time give the Republican minority a say-so in the hiring of 1/3 of all committee staff. The Rules Committee vote was 9-0. Senate Majority Leader Robert Byrd and Senate Minority Leader Howard Baker support it, and it goes to the Senate floor for a debate and vote next Monday. Tonight, we take a look at the reorganization proposal and its purposes and the objections to it. Senator Adlai Stevenson, Democrat of Illinois, chaired the special committee that started it all. His select committee on the committee system has been working since April on a plan that the Rules Committee then modified considerably and passed out yesterday. First, Senator, could you give us an overview of the problems that caused the need for the reorganization in the first place?
Well, first of all, reorganization won't guarantee sound policy, but it will, I think, make it possible, and it isn't now. As you mentioned, there are 31 subcommittees of the Senate. There are some 174 subcommittees in the Senate. A senator, on the average, has 18 committee assignments. Some have much more than that. Some have less. We have so many committee assignments now that it makes it impossible for us to do justice by any of them. The jurisdictions of the subcommittees and of the committees have been overtaken by events. They're spread all across the Senate. Policy ends up getting made piecemeal, very difficult, for example, to put together a comprehensive energy policy with a dozen or so committees sharing the jurisdiction.
When IRDA, the government energy agency, had some problems, they wanted to go to the Senate, they discovered there were 15 committees working on energy, and 14 standing committees, 2 select committees, and 31 subcommittees working on energy alone.
Well,
that's the kind of thing
that's the kind of thing, and it's no wonder the nation doesn't have a comprehensive energy policy, nor a transportation policy. So one of the efforts is to roughly draw the jurisdictional lines by function, to try to put the energy jurisdiction in an energy committee. The effort is to try to not reduce the workload. We can't succeed in doing that, but we can try to equalize workload and responsibility between committees and between senators in order to handle it more effectively.
All right, Senator, how did you go about making the decisions, or the decisions that you would make the recommendations that certain committees be abolished?
Well, we started with all of the committees and decided which ones were essential. And they included all of the standing committees of the Senate, and we made only one exception for select, special, joint, and so on, and that was the newly created Intelligence Committee, which has an important and sensitive responsibility. We decided that the jurisdictions of all of the other committees either could be or were in part already being exercised by other committees. So from then on, the effort was to consolidate. Now, there was a tactical consideration, too, and That was simply a concern on the part of many members that if we made an exception for one committee, we would that would quickly be followed by others. I wasn't unhappy to see an exception or two made. One is the Joint Economic Committee. I think that's a unique committee with a...
Now, you're talking about on your committee, or are you talking about on what the Rules Committee actually
that was proposed by the Rules Committee, and I suggested it.
Well, now, the Rules Committee did make several changes that I mentioned. You wanted the number of standing committees reduced to 15. They only went to 23. And there are a lot of other things that they changed, some big, some small. Is there enough room left to make a difference? I mean, what they have left that goes to the Senate, is that going to make a difference and resolve all these problems that you laid out?
Yes. Well, first of all, this is part of the tactics. We were seeking a little bit more than we wanted. I really didn't want to abolish, for example, the Joint Economic Committee. Some of the surviving committees require legislation. In other words, the concurrence of the House before they can be abolished. The Joint Committee on the Library or Printing should be abolished, but they aren't essential to the plan. The plan is basically intact. My greatest disappointments were over the failure of the Rules Committee to create a comprehensive energy committee and a comprehensive, well, we did that, a comprehensive transportation.
Yeah, there is an energy
committee. That was the...
But generally speaking, you're satisfied with what the Rules Committee came up with. Senator, thank you. One of the most outspoken critics of the plan, one part of it at least, has been Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. Senator McGovern, what's the basis of your opposition to this overall plan?
Well, first let me say that I don't oppose the entire scale of recommendations of Senator Stevenson and his committee. I think, for example, it's just common sense that we go to the use of computers as the committee has recommended in scheduling our committee meetings so that we don't have a dozen meetings going on at the same time involving the same senators. My basic quarrel with my friend Adlai Stevenson and his committee is that they made an assumption that select committees, special committees, were bad and that they should be abolished. And they applied a meat axe to those committees without regard to the quality of work that those committees were doing. For example, the Nutrition Committee was knocked out.
Now, that's one that you're the chairman of.
I happen to be the chairman, but even if I weren't chairman, I would recognize that nutrition is a very important problem that ought not to be swallowed in the Committee on Agriculture. Now, I serve on the Committee on Agriculture. I think it's a very important committee. But I'm convinced, based on my experience both on the Agricultural Committee and as chairman of the Nutrition Committee, that we would not have made the progress we have here in the United States in developing a concern nationwide about nutrition had it not been for the work of the Select Committee. The same thing is true about the Committee on Aging. The elderly people don't have the kind of a lobby that I would like to see them have unless they can maintain this special committee that has done an effective job. We need to keep in mind that all of these select and special committees were created because at some point the Senate perceived that there was a real need that was not being met by these old line standing committees. And that's my basic quarrel. I think it's wrong to assume that because you have a committee that's called select or is called special that it ought to get the axe.
Senator, how do you feel that the decisions were made to abolish these various committees, including your own?
Well, I'm afraid it was done partially on the basis of power. The Reorganization Committee made what was probably an accurate judgment that they didn't have the political muscle to do anything about the Committee on Finance or the Committee on Appropriations. Those are old-line standing committees with very powerful senior senators serving as chairman. But to attack a little committee like Nutrition, which has a small staff and a small budget and somewhat junior senators serving on it, is a juicy target. We don't have the muscle. We don't have a big political lobby out in the country that's well organized. Now, the committee, Senator Stevenson's committee, recommended doing away with the Veterans Committee. They lost that battle in the Rules Committee because the veterans have political muscle. They got the American Legion and the VFW and other veterans groups to go to bat for them, and they succeeded in retaining that committee. But the Select Committee on Nutrition, which deals with hungry people, the Special Committee on the Aging, which deals with the old and the weak, those are the committees that are still slated for transfer to larger committees where I think their functions will be lost sight of.
Senator, how upset are you about what's happened to the Nutrition Committee and these other committees? Are you going to wage an all-out fight to stop this when it goes to the floor?
Yes, I am. I'm sponsoring a resolution with a number of other senators to save the Nutrition Committee. Now, I have enough respect for Senator Stevenson, who's my colleague and my good friend in the Senate, so that I did go to the chairman of the Agricultural Committee to see what we might work out if we had to transfer our committee there, and I'm not satisfied with the assurances I got. I'm afraid that we will lose sight of the all-important concern that we've built up on the nutritional health of the American people if this committee is swallowed by the Committee on Agriculture. Keep in mind that the basic function of the Committee on Agriculture has been to serve the interests of farmers, and that's as it should be, to serve see that they get adequate income and adequate pricing. And I don't want to see this committee that is concerned with our nutritional health swallowed up by a committee whose basic purpose is something other than that.
All right, Senator, thank you. Common Cause, the well-known government reform lobby, has been actively backing the reorganization plan, and David Cohen is the president of Common Cause. Mr. Cohen, first of all, how do you respond to the points that Senator McGovern made, that these decisions were made by Senator Stevenson's committee first and then the Rules Committee second, based on who had the power rather than what the needs were?
Oh, I think there's a lot of merit to that. Any reorganization, first of all, I think the Stevenson plan should have been brought to the Senate floor right away. If the Senate were serious about reorganization, it wouldn't have gone to the Rules Committee for the chopping block. Committees, we need reorganization because power is out of focus in the Senate, and the Senate Finance Committee is the worst abuser. That wasn't touched. But I think we also have to be prepared to face up to the Senate becoming a modern institution. And that means that committees, including valuable select committees, and I helped create Senator McGovern's Select Committee many years ago, they run their termination time. The Senate Agriculture Committee shouldn't be a committee just for farmers. It probably has too much representation for producers and not farmers, and doesn't pay enough attention to consumers. And we have to build that into the Senate Agriculture Committee. We have to face up to that and do that. And I'm sorry to say that I think the Senate Rules Committee has set reorganization back. The Stevenson proposal was an important first step. And I think the Rules Committee did a lot of derailing along the way.
Oh, how do you feel about the proposal as it now sits? I mean, are you still supporting that, or?
We're going to oppose any effort to weaken it. I don't think the real question is it better than nothing? The real question is the recognition that reorganization is a continuing process, and the job is far from done, and I hope that and we're going to work to see that this present plan its value is not oversold.
All right, this is a first step then, rather than the whole
But it's a small step, and that doesn't mean it's insignificant. The Senate showed the Rules Committee showed what it could do when it made some sensible moves on energy. It refused to make those moves on transportation. Equally serious problem, and yet we still have a fragmented situation in the Senate Committee. That's a clear example of the job not being done. In the field of health, the job is not done because you have the new Human Resources Committee dealing with some health matters, but the Senate Financing Committee continuing to hold its power on Medicare and Medicaid and not even doing very much about correcting a lot of abuses.
All right, Mr. Cohen, thank you. Senator McGovern's Nutrition Committee is not the only one that would bite the dust under this proposal. Another is the Senate Select Committee on Aging, as Senator McGovern mentioned. This committee is chaired by Senator Frank Church. Senator Church is as upset as Senator McGovern, and so are senior citizen lobbying groups such as the National Council of Senior Citizens, and Rudolph Danstedt is assistant to the president of the council. Mr. Danstedt, the Aging Committee would come under the Human Resources Committee under this reorganization plan.
Right.
Why are you opposed to that?
Well, I think we're kind of astonished because we just don't see the Human Resources Committee being able to do the job. that's been done by the Senate Special Committee on Aging over the past 16 years. I've watched this committee over the 16 years I've been here in Washington and longer, and I'd like to note the fact that this Special Committee on Aging did not come about as a result of lobbying from outside groups. The late Senator MacNeil looked around and saw how aging problems were being handled in finance, labor and public welfare, over in housing, and 2 or 3 other spots, and decided there ought to be some coordinating device. But he didn't want a legislative group. He wanted a research and study group. So he set up the Senate Special Committee on Aging. And if you take a little look at what they've done over the years, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to say I'm not too sure that the Temporary Select Committee did look in depth at the activities of the Senate Special Committee on Aging, because they've covered the waterfront in terms of all the needs of the elderly, economic needs, Social Security, SSI, revenue sharing, pensions have been covered, health care needs, Medicare, Medicaid, personal care needs, nursing homes, substitutes for nursing homes, and the rest of that, housing, like 202, for example, employment, such as the Senior Age Program, which we operate in the National Council of Senior Citizens, recreational socialization needs, and I could go on and indicate the gamut they've covered. I brought with me, but I'm not going to show it, 3 illustrations of I think some very solid studies have made. The first of these was on the whole field of economics of aging, which for the first time, it had not been done by the administration, by the executive branch, had not been done by Congress, took a broad-scale look at the income status of the elderly. And it was an important piece of work with respect to the 60% Social Security increases that were
Let me
obtained.
ask you this, sir. You're wise in the ways of the U.S. Senate.
Yes,
what do
sir.
you think happened to you?
Well, I'm not sure what happened to us. I'm inclined to think that what Senator McGovern indicated was correct, that somehow this looked as though it could be one committee that there wouldn't be too much trouble with in terms of elimination. Also, I think there was a misunderstanding, in all honesty, as to the gamut of activities carried on by this committee, and an assumption that if you assign to the Human Resources Committee concern for the aging, it would cover it. Except there are about 5 or 6 exceptions. It won't cover Medicaid, it won't cover Social Security, it won't cover Medicare, it won't cover housing, it won't cover transportation. Those all will have to land in other legislative committees. So we'd be back again to where we were in 1961, and as our president said one time, we'd have to reinvent the wheel again.
Well, finally, excuse me, Senator Stevenson, believe me, I'm coming back to you, sir. Finally, are you opposed to reorganization, period, or just as it affects this
We're
one
opposed to the elimination of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. I think, insofar as I've examined this particular study, I think we would support almost all the other recommendations, including a reduction in the size of committees, including some prescription, whereby senators could serve on only such committees and all the rest of that. And I might, that's all I'll say about it.
Senator Stevenson.
This is the story of my recent life.
I know
it's a
it
very
is.
familiar
I know it is.
refrain. Everyone
I
is
hope
for
you've heard it.
reorganization, but, and then the buts begin to add up, and it's very difficult to draw the line. But let me assure you, we did take a hard look at the work of both of your committees, the Committee on the Aging and the Committee on Nutrition, which Senator McGovern chairs very ably. And there was never a quarrel with the quality of the work of either of those committees. That work is being done extremely well. That was not the test we put to ourselves. The test that we put was not the work of each committee, but the work of the United States Senate. And we concluded that there was no sound reason for spreading the jurisdiction of those committees and other committees among any number of separate committees, wasting resources, conflicting jurisdictions, making responsibility easy to avoid. Senator Church and others have mentioned in connection with the Committee on Aging, it's a very sound, worthwhile investigation of Medicaid scandals. No one would quarrel with that, but we did quarrel with the need for 4 investigations simultaneously of Medicaid in the United States.
You know, I looked into that, Senator. I looked into that, and I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. I tried to check it out, and I'm not entirely sure that I'm correct on this. But I think I am. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask Senator McGovern a question based on what Mr. Cohen said, that isn't it not more proper for nutrition to also be considered by the Agriculture Committee and not just be a committee for farmers?
Well, let me speak to that. I agree that the Committee on Agriculture needs a larger focus. When I said its primary responsibility is to farmers, I think that's a fair statement, and it's a judgment of what that committee is going to do, no matter what it's assigned. But there are other obligations. It does need to be concerned about nutrition. And this leads me to the point that I think is being overlooked here tonight. There's a general assumption that it's bad to have overlapping committee jurisdictions.
I would agree.
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I think that sometimes overlapping is good because it creates a competition between committees. We're saying, in effect, to the Committee on Agriculture, if you don't move on the nutrition subject, the Select Committee is. And that's exactly what we did. We took that committee out to the country. We looked at areas of hunger and malnutrition across this country that had never been examined by the Committee on Agriculture. We called in the doctors. We called in the dietitians. We went to the medical schools. And we were able to build a competition outside of the framework of the Agricultural Committee that led them to begin moving in this field. And I would say, in all due respects, that the same thing can happen in other areas. If you close off these other avenues of competition, what I call the competition of ideas, it has the same result that it does in the business world, where you boil all the business activity down to a few giants, you lose the advantage of competition.
May I add to that, Senator? May I add to that also? I mean, I think it's related to this. The Senate Special Committee on Aging has no legislative jurisdiction at all.
Neither does the
Nutrition Study and
Committee.
Analysis Group,
Neither
which
does
I
the
think
Nutrition
is quite
Committee.
different. Whereas, you know, our dear Committee on Veterans Affairs does have legislative jurisdiction.
Mr. Cohen, what has your organization found on this overlap problem, or what's your feeling on the overlap problem?
The overlap problem is really results in such a confusion and such a blurring often of jurisdictions that the responsibility isn't fixed. Now, I'm not talking about the competition of ideas, but I think there comes a point when there has to be some sense of responsibility, as there is now beginning to be in the energy field, of Democratic senators, since Democrats are the majority party, of saying, agriculture, you really got to begin to focus on that nutrition problem and come up with legislative remedies. And I think the role that Senator McGovern is saying that his select committee played is absolutely accurate. But we also have to be able to terminate those select committees through a sunsetting procedure and begin to force the responsibility into the legislative committee. And Senator, I hope you drive as hard a bargain as you can with Senator Talmadge.
If I thought that were possible, I wouldn't be waging this fight. I'm not interested in power as such. You know me well enough to know that. I'm interested in the Nutrition Committee doing the job it has to do. Now, Adlai speaks of the quality of the work of our committee and suggests that the same quality could be done in the Committee on Agriculture. The problem with that is that we've built up a highly competent staff in the Nutrition Committee, some 18 people, 8 or 9 of them professionals in this field that really know the whole gamut of nutrition. We're not guaranteed.
Aren't they going to go to the Senate Agriculture
They are not
Committee?
going to go with us. I've discussed this matter with the chairman of the Agricultural Committee. He says, I don't want to build up an increased staff over here. We'll give you a couple of people. Yeah. We can't do the work in nutrition with 2 professional staffers.
Let me ask Senator Stevenson a question about staff. Is that going to be, right now I believe that there are something like 2,000 members of the Senate committee staffs, having risen from 200 and some in 1947. Under this reorganization plan, will there be Senate staff members laid off? Will the overall staff be reduced?
We can't be very precise because we don't know what will happen if, for example, the Nutrition Committee is consolidated with the Agriculture Committee, but it looks as if there are something more than 200 staff members who are directly affected by consolidation. In other words, their committees, the committees that they serve are consolidated. But it's the assumption, it's also been our assumption that during a transition period, which we provide for, staff would be consolidated. It would be fitted, much of it, into the surviving committees, and that much of it would continue. Now, you mentioned one other aspect which clouds the picture, and that's the provision that was added in the Rules Committee to give the Republicans 1/3 of staff.
How did that come about?
Well, that was a slip. That came about with the support of some Democrats. On the face of it, it looks just, and something certainly should be done to make certain that the minority is adequately served by staff. But most of the staff work for these committees is nonpartisan. It's putting together the hearings, it's putting together the reports, it's getting the bills drafted and printed and so on. And that is done by majority staff, typically. So if that work is to continue, what you end up doing in order to give the Republicans their one-third is to add on more staff.
Well, Senator, I don't mean to be cynical, but wasn't that done really as an effort to get the Republican vote for the overall plan?
No.
No?
No, this was brought up by a Republican and supported by, I think, 2 Democrats. And it was adopted over the opposition of most of the Democrats on the committee. Which is not to say that something shouldn't be done. We had hoped to turn our attention to this, among other things.
We have just a couple minutes left. I want to ask, first of all, each one of you what you think is going to happen to this plan now when it goes to the floor of the Senate next week. You have any guesses on this, Mr. Danstedt?
It's not a guess. It's a hope when you come right down to it. I think that I would say this, that the elderly in this country look upon the Senate Special Committee on Aging as their friend at court, as their ombudsman. I can't believe that the United States Senate, which has been very supportive of programs for the elderly, is going to discontinue it, also in the light of the fact that the White House is going to have a council on aging. It seems to me I just can't accept it at this point, and we don't intend to accept it.
Mr. Cohen.
I think there are going to be constant efforts to make the reorganization even less modern, and they have to be resisted. And I think there's going to be...
That includes Mr. Danstedt, right?
That's right.
We're prepared to handle it.
But more than that, there's really going to be a test of Mr. Byrd and Mr. Baker and their willingness to tangle with power, and particularly if this...
What do you think is going to happen?
If the reorganization goes forward, we're going to see if Robert Byrd is going to look at the Senate Finance Committee and begin to unload it of some of its excessive jurisdiction.
Senator McGovern, are there enough of you to...
I want to emphasize the point that Senator Stevenson began with, that reorganization is not magic. It doesn't mean either worse government or better government. It depends on where we stand on the great issues before the country, not how many committees we have. And one of those great issues is the nutritional health of the American people. What we eat determines our health to a great extent.
Are you going to get it back in, do you think?
I think we are. We're going to fight for it.
Senator Stevenson.
Well, the only reason for this proposal is to better serve those with special needs, like the elderly, those who are hungry, and everybody else. And if there was any other reason for doing this, I don't know what it is. It's that reason that brings us here. I think this is going to remain intact with 1 or 2 possible exceptions.
We have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you all for being with us. I'm Jim Lehrer. Robert MacNeil will be back tomorrow night. Thank you and good night.
For a transcript, send $1 to the MacNeil-Lehrer Report, Box 345, New York, New York, 10019. The MacNeil-Lehrer Report was produced by WNET and WETA. They are solely responsible for its content. The program was made possible in part by grants from public television stations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Exxon Corporation, and the Ford Foundation.